Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this new CERRE webinar. So at CERRE, we have initiated since several months now a line of research on data and AI. And the report we will present today are in this context. The report of today is how to improve personal data portability in order to better empower an EU citizen in a data society, and also in order to stimulate innovations in Europe. So the report of today is very much around a possible improvement or better implementation of the famous GDPR, which was creating this new right. But as I said, this is part of a broader line of research, and so in September we will complement the report of today with another report, which is more on data sharing in order to ensure a better market contestabilities in Europe, so more linked to economic regulation and antitrust. Okay, so the presentation of today is timely because, as you probably know, the European Commission is about to adopt its first report on the GDPR. The GDPR, who, as I said, introduced this new personal data portability right, and the Commission is also thinking at a new strategy for data. But it's not only the European Commission. A lot of other international organizations are thinking how to improve data sharing and data portability, and the OECD is very active in the domain, and this is why we are very happy to have one representative of the OECD involved in the work. And the tech firms are also very much active in establishing platforms for data sharing and data portability. And Facebook is part of one of these very important projects, the data transfer project, which is aiming to facilitate portability between platforms. So this is for the context. Now, how the debate of today will take place. So we have 1 hour and a half together. So Jan Kramer, who is a professor at the University of Passau and a joint academic director at CERRE, will present the main insight of the report and what does it mean in terms of policy implication. And then we will have a reaction for our 4 panelists, all of them which are very much involved in the debate. So first, Christian from the OECD, who is one of the brain on the reflection on of the OECD around data sharing and data portability. You may remember that the OECD has adopted a very important report at the end of last year on data sharing and access, and is continuing to work on the topics. Then we have Lucy from Ofcom, a principal economist at Ofcom. Ofcom is also very much thinking at data portability, in particular for telecom consumer, for them to be able to understand better how to choose their telecom operators. Then we will have Johan from Facebook, Director of Public Policy at Facebook, which, as you imagine, is a key actor in the system and is very much involved in the data transfer project. And we will finish with Paul Nemeth from the European Commission, from DG Just. You may remember that Paul was very much instrumental in the adoption of the GDPR. So thanks very much to all. And then if you want to ask a question, please use Slido. You have the reference on the screen on my back. So Slido CERRE Digital. So we will take those questions during the debate. Thank you very much. And Jan, you have the screen.
Welcome, everyone. Also from my side, so I'm very happy to present the report on making data portability more effective for the digital economy, which we presented together, drafted together with Alexandre Destrel and Pierre Senenar. And so first I want to clarify what the context and the scope of this particular report is. Alexandre already introduced that the notion of data portability was introduced in European law in the context of GDPR, Article 20, However, there's also different legislation that also supports data portability. And the Digital Content Directive, for example, and the Free Flow of Data Directive, and also some sector-specific regulation in, for example, banking, automotive, and energy. This particular report is really focused on the role of personal data portability. So not so much data portability in the context of, for example, switching cloud providers in the free flow of data, so non-personal data portability. And it's in the context of the digital economy specifically. So GDPR as a horizontal regulation, of course, applies not only to in the context of the digital economy, but more generally. But here we're looking at specifically how data portability could be made more effective in the context of the digital economy. So this brings me to the central research question that we address in this report. That is, what is the legal, technical, and economic framework for personal data portability currently, and how can personal data portability be made more effective in the future? So what are some of the findings in brief of our report? We looked at these three areas: legal framework, technical framework, and economic framework in the context of data portability. And the first issue that we sort of identified is that there are still some legal uncertainties regarding particularly the scope of the right of data portability under GDPR, but also possibly some liability issues that need to be addressed. So the European Data Protection Board notes that data portability and the scope of data to be covered under data portability should be considered relatively broadly. So not only covering volunteered data that has been explicitly given by the data subjects, but also observed data. So data that is implicitly given by data subject, such as click streams or other viewing histories, for example. But it's not 100% clear in how that should be lived in practice. And if you sort of look at some of the data portability requests that you can do, not all of this clickstream data, for example, is typically included. There's also issues of liability, particularly with respect to the rights of third parties, rights of others that might be affected when you port data from one provider to another. Also, what we highlight is that continuous data portability requests are not covered by the law. So transferring data in real time from one provider to another is not under the scope of GDPR, but would be necessary for the actual free flow of data and for also truly facilitating switching and multi-homing in the digital economy. We also look at the technical possibilities of continuous data portability and argue that it's challenging but feasible to do. There are some demonstration projects. We have already highlighted in the introduction the data transfer project, but there's also another project called Solid, which demonstrate that technically it is feasible to do data portability in a continuous way. However, both of these projects are still very much in their infancy. The collection of personal data, finally, which is another reason that consumers should be empowered to transfer the data from one provider to another, currently is very much concentrated. So particularly data on different activities collected throughout the web is just concentrated at very few firms, and it would allow more data portability, would allow consumers to take that more from one provider to another. Second of all, if we look at more the economic interactions that are triggered by data portability, we show that, and some research has emerged on this, shows that particularly the horizontal nature of data portability triggers really some complex economic interactions. So because it applies not only to small firms, but also to large firms, it might actually enshrine some of the current data aggregation practices. And there are also some undesired effects that could come about with the right to data portability. We also argue from an innovation perspective that the free flow of personal data would decouple what we call innovation at the service level from innovation at the data analytics level. So currently it's the case that if you have a very successful consumer-facing service, then you also get more inflow of data, which then helps you to improve the data analytics and the algorithms that you run for the service, which then improves you to help you improve the service, which then draws in more consumers. So there's sort of a virtuous cycle in here. And if we would decouple this a little bit, then the innovation at the data analytics level, so improvement of algorithms and so on, could be fed with this personal data as well, or data about consumers generally as well. And you don't need to have a very successful consumer-facing service at the same time. So particularly if data portability is confined to raw data, raw input data from consumers, and not any inferred data. So inferred data in terms of refined data that has been refined through algorithms already. We argue this is likely to increase innovation and competition, even beyond the high level of the status quo, the high level of innovation that we currently see in the digital economy. The last thing we look at is the personal information management systems, of course, or short PIMS. And these personal information management systems, we believe, are likely to play a very significant role in the data economy. Once the free flow of data, personal data, becomes more prevalent. So you need to consent on the one hand to these different data flows. You need to have the place to monitor all these data flows and also to manage these data flows, possibly through the use of personal information management systems from one provider going to another. And for this reason, we believe that generally personal information management systems have a significant role to play. However, we also show that they will struggle to find a self-sustained business model, economically self-sustained business model, if there is no further support. And particularly, we argue that there needs to be standards for continuous data portability and consent management to facilitate the emergence of these personal information management systems that will still struggle to find a business model. But we then believe that open source and nonprofit solutions might have a ground to grow on. This brings me already to the policy recommendations that we make in this report. There's three main areas of policy recommendations that I would like to highlight here. First is that we argue that there needs to be a more effective enforcement and a clearer scope of data portability as it is under GDPR Article 20. There are still, as I've highlighted before, some legal uncertainties, so we must have more legal certainty here, particularly on the scope of data portability. So how far is observed data part of, or should be part of, the right to data portability under GDPR already? Because this will be the building block for what we'll call continuous data portability, which should have the same scope as data portability more general here. So, and the second thing is on legal certainty regarding third parties. So a lot of these portability requests will also affect third parties. If you think about, for example, porting a picture in which a friend has been tagged, then this portability might also affect that the privacy rights of this friend that's been tagged. And this might be that for this reason alone, you're not porting the pictures at all. But there might also be some ways in between where you need to consent. For example, third parties would need to consent to such data portability requests. So generally, very complex trade-offs can arise in this particular context. And in a lot of cases, it will actually require a case-by-case analysis for specific services, how to handle this trade-off. But in order to make this effective, we cannot wait for too long for court cases to go through all these different instances. So there needs to be really some guidance on timely guidance on how to resolve these different trade-offs that might arise under Article 20 already with respect to data portability. Finally, also, there needs to be, of the current provisions, there needs to be an effective monitoring and enforcement, particularly concerning the timeliness of the fulfillment of the request. So generally, you have up to 30 days under GDPR to comply with request, data portability request. Of course, in the context of the digital economy, where all of this data already is in a machine readable form and usually readily available, 30 days seem a very long time. So here, shorter periods could be foreseen, and as we argue in the next step, in some instances, even a continuous, so real-time fulfillment of a data portability request should be in order. And also relating to the completeness of data. So once the scope of the data has been clarified, the question is the data really complete? And this also of course needs to be monitored and enforced if it's not. So now we're moving on to an area which is not covered by GDPR as it is, because we argue that GDPR is not sufficient for really the consent-based free flow of personal data in the particular context of the digital economy, where data is available in a machine-readable form, where a lot of times data is already available through some APIs, but not in a sufficient way. So here we see a need for near instantaneous data portability to facilitate switching and multi-homing between services in order to truly empower consumers. And we also need here to be including the observed data, which we think is very useful for input for other services as well. So my browsing history, if I wish to consent to this, my browsing history, for example, done at, or my history generally of actions done at one service, could, if I want to consent to that, I could transfer it to another service in real time. So not in a 30-day update cycle, but in a really continuous manner. In order to facilitate this data transport, this data portability, we also say that there should be a need for B2B data transfer through common standards and APIs, so application programming interfaces. So you don't necessarily have to go through a personal information management systems, or you don't have to go through your personal computer to transfer the data, but you can do it directly between the two providers. And we think that this is necessary to make data portability practical. And of course, these interfaces would need to be available with a high availability as well. So in the same availability as you would have for consumer-facing interfaces, for example. So the scope of data portability as under GDPR should be adopted also here for continuous data portability. So we don't envision a larger or smaller scope. But the trade-offs that I alluded to before in the context of GDPR Article 20 already, that might be complex, are of course amplified in the context of a continuous data portability, because data becomes available immediately here. So what we say is that there should be some development here in this area of first a code of conduct on common standards and APIs, including appropriate performance criteria to facilitate this type of continuous data portability that we have in mind. We also lay out some guidelines for the implementation. First and foremost, we think that it should be an industry-led development, as it has also been done in the context of the free flow of data regulation. And this could then build also on existing projects like the data transfer project of Solid. But generally, we think a first step would be an industry-led development here, particularly safeguarded with some governmental intervention or setting up multi-stakeholder groups, for example. Then, second of all, we think there should be a fine granular consent possible for consumers on which data is then subjected to data portability. So if you just want to transfer your pictures, you just transfer the pictures and not the whole data that you have at one provider or another. This might also include that third parties need to consent to data transfers of others. So then would need to be an updating of the consent mechanisms here as well. Security should be key, so these transfers should be secure. Open standards should be preferred for this. And I said that before, a high reliability and performance of the APIs is necessary. For example, comparable to the user interface. These trade-offs have already been taken account, for example, also in other types of legislation like open banking, And in the UK also, there's an active movement on smart data, which is focused on the network industries. So these things are not uncommon in this context. And the general proposal of a more continuous data portability is also not unprecedented. The final set of recommendation goes to enabling this set of personal information management systems. So as said before, we believe that these are valuable and important pieces of software to facilitate the data portability. However, we also have identified some problems, economic problems, with their emergence. And there are some of these projects already on the market, but none of them seem to strive as it stands right now. So we really think that focus should shift a little bit more to open source and nonprofit solutions. And for those to emerge, it probably requires, on top of the standards for data portability that I've already addressed previously in the previous slide, additionally standards for consent management. So how to decentralize, sort of say the consent management that you've given at the various providers. So you have sort of a centralized dashboard where you can manage the flow of data going from one provider that you use to another provider that you might use. Because these are then open source and nonprofit solutions, there might also be a role for privacy seals and certification of PIMs by governments, because they have a very central role, and they also have access to very sensitive data because of this. And finally, one thought that we develop in this piece, in this report, is that there is an ongoing effort at the EU level on identity management, on facilitating identity management. And that could be coupled potentially with efforts on consent management, centralized consent management, standards for consent management, that would then also be helpful for the emergence of PIMs here and the use of PIMs. Okay, so with this, I close my presentation of the main aspects of the report. I'm looking forward to the responses and the discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jan. So the report is available on the CERRE website now, so you can look by yourself if you want. So basically, if I get it right, there is three main messages that Jan just conveyed. We need to implement a bit better the existing right, and it's normal. I mean, it's a new right, so it's always like that. When you have a new law, it takes a little bit of time to be implemented well, but it also needs to be complemented with additional measure, in particular continuous data, and then some incentive for PIMs. Lucy, now Jan mentioned that there is this big smart data project in the UK, of which Ofcom is involved. So if you can also give your take on the recommendation of the report, and also explain a little bit what you plan to do, and if possible in 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, thanks for a really interesting paper. There's a lot to think about there, and I could comment on various parts of it, but I'm going to particularly focus on talking about our practical initiative for sharing personal data in the telecommunications industry that we're working on at Ofcom. It's very similar initiative to open banking, which you have referenced in your paper, and it's trying to do some similar things. So just to let you know, we're at a moderately early stage in thinking through this. We're hoping to publish some of our early stage thinking in a couple of months and get some reactions from various people, in particular industry and stakeholders who might be interested in using this data to try and gauge the appetite for that and some of the difficulties that we think might be part of it. In open communications, as we're calling it, consumers and small businesses will be able to request that their telecoms provider, and that's broadband or mobile or pay TV potentially, would share some of the data that they have on the consumer or business with a third party, so that the customer can get a better service or some sort of innovative services. And so it's obviously going to be absolutely key to set what data that means, what data could be shared. So it will certainly be the gathered data, the data that the customers offered, and almost certainly not derived data, but we need to think about observed data, because we're thinking about data on the way you use your telecom services, and we think that there could be a lot of utility from sharing that. This particular data initiative is not about competition between platforms per se, but it's about consumer outcomes in the market, the process of consumers engaging in the market, and potentially about competition in the telecoms industry. We expect it to help consumers engage with the market and find a better deal, because they'll be able to use some of the data that their provider has on them, such as their current tariff or usage, as I mentioned, to compare new products in the market. But we also really hope to see a whole range of innovative applications coming out of this, as has been the case in open banking, which was supposed to be an initiative about switching current accounts, and actually has really been about innovative applications that have taken this data and enabled people to sort of engage with their transactions data in ways that weren't predicted. And there's now about 170 third parties that are registered for open banking and that are supplying services with open banking. And so, of course, it is very difficult to predict what these innovations might be. Thinking about what you've said in the paper, we do feel that not so much for engaging in the market, but for some of these innovations, continuous data sharing could well be a really key part of that. We're very much thinking about the issue of whether current legislation is sufficient to make open communications happen in a way that will be effective. And we suspect it won't be, and we might need some sector-specific legislation, as did open banking, for things to ensure that the data is shared with a very low latency. It needs to be immediate to be useful, to ensure that data is very much standardized and there's a very clear knowledge of what the relevant metrics are, and the continuous access. As you mentioned in the paper, this idea of sharing immediately through APIs, we think that's a very likely way that this is going to happen in open communications. You know, in the paper, that there are not necessarily any technical challenges to standardizing the data, and this does seem right from the thinking we've done so far, but we do expect it could be costly for telecoms providers to meet obligations on sharing standardized data, very much depending on what data we're talking about and their current systems. And so we'll absolutely need to spend some time agreeing standards and metrics very clearly before we begin. It's very important to clarify that in advance, rather than keep changing the goalposts, I think, to save costs on the industry. And as you mentioned in your introduction, working groups with industry will be key to work through this. One final issue that we're engaging with, which wasn't much in the paper, but is the idea for consent in data sharing. How can you get truly informed consent, but not be a barrier to the data sharing producing its benefits? Obviously, people need to know what they're agreeing to, but a very long process of talking through what's being shared and for what purpose could also put people off and stop them getting the benefits. So that's also something we're wrestling with at the moment. That's it from me. Until any questions, thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucy, for sharing your thought and experience. So what I gather is that probably additional legislation or code of conduct would be necessary. Also, it's interesting what you say about open banking. The idea at the beginning was allowing people to switch, but at the end of the day, what it was creating is a series of innovation in the fintech industries in the UK, and that's clearly very interesting and very useful. Now, let's go to Johan. So, of course, Facebook is a very important actor in that game. Facebook has produced a very interesting white paper on data portability. So I mentioned also that Facebook is part of the data transfer project. But in this white paper on data portability, Facebook was raising a series of issue, tension or risk, to take the expression of Christian, which are important and which needs to be solved or decided before we need to go further. So, Johan, what did you think about the recommendation, and also if you want to expand a bit on what Facebook plans to do in the future in that regard? You are very welcome again in 5 minutes, that would be great.
I'll do my best. Thank you, Alexander, and also Jan and Pierre. Compliments with the paper. Congrats with that. I'll say a couple of things about what Facebook is doing in this area in a moment, and then I will also comment on some parts of the paper, which I will try to sort of optimize, given that Christian covered a lot of ground there also, and I think that everyone's fully aware that this is a very important building block, but definitely not the end of the conversation. And you mentioned yourself, Alexander, that there will be a follow-up report, which is moving a little bit more into the direction of the contestability of markets, which I think is a very relevant aspect also to take into consideration if you talk about data portability in a more broader sense. But first, let me comment a little bit on what Facebook is doing in this space. We believe, as some of my colleagues, including Mark Zuckerberg himself, have been saying over the last year or two, that people should be able to share their data from apps and services, and also to transport those to other services. And we have, as you said just a minute ago, Alexander, issued a couple of tools in place to accommodate this. We have been giving the people the right to download the information that you can then transfer to other services. And we are also, and you mentioned this, and it's also in the report, member of the Data Transfer Project, which is a project with some of our tech peers, but it's also open for other companies, where we try to increase the smooth transfer of data between services. This is an ongoing project, and it's still improving and broadening in scope. And as I said, people can join this project, and I think it's also interesting to see what the experiences are, also in light of the recommendations that you pushed forward in this report. The white paper that you mentioned, Alexander, yeah, I can imagine that if you refer to it, that it looks more like that we raise a lot of issues in there, which is true. But as we also pointed out in that paper, and it's by the way freely accessible via our website. If you Google on Newsroom, Facebook, you can all access it and dive a little bit deeper. There are 4 issues mentioned that need to be tackled if you talk about data portability, also in light of the privacy obligations that are in place, definitely in Europe, but also globally. And we tried with the white paper to help the debate a little bit by addressing those, not about pushing back, but by taking these into account to meanwhile empower consumers to share the data, but without violating those rules. And I think that Jan, in his presentation, gave a couple of those examples of the complexity of data, because if you post something yourself and you tag a friend, then it immediately raises questions about privacy, etc., and who's owning those kind of data. That's what we try to address in the white paper, and we proposed a couple of directions, not immediate solutions, because it's the complexity, and we hope that with projects like these, but definitely also with the upcoming consultations under DSA, that we can contribute with further insights into the specifics of all those issues and challenges. But in general, we are definitely supportive of transferring data. We also launched a Data for Good project. Again, this is also publicly available information, so I won't dive deeper into this, also for the interest of time. But I think this is about data sharing of Facebook data with, for instance, academia, but also humanitarian organizations and other governments to help increase, for instance, public health issues, and definitely also with the COVID-19 response. We've been working closely together with many institutions and governments to help with our data on an anonymous basis, of course, to improve dealing with crises like those we are facing right now. These are just a couple of examples. There's a lot more, but for the interest of time, I will now move to the report, which I think provides a great overview, definitely of the legal areas that are all in place in the EU, and in some cases even broader. Some of the technical aspects, which, as you rightly acknowledge, is pretty complex. But I think the report has a lot of interesting thoughts and recommendations about improving the technical details about how you can port data. And I think the continuous data portability, as Jan mentioned, is an interesting thought, which probably need to be thought through given the practical matters. But as a sort of direction where we need to move into, I think it's a very interesting and important way to make things better in that space. Other aspects of the report that are interesting are the ones about consumer rights and what I call consumer empowerment, giving people the power to own their data and use it and move it to other services where there are, apart from the continuous data portability, some recommendations which we would definitely support. I think if you move a little bit to the other part, the economic dimensions that are mentioned in the report, which are more like competition-like, I think that a couple of the statements in there are quite bold in my perspective and need to be thought through a little bit more, which I also hope that you will address in your follow-up paper about the contestability of markets. So I see it more as the first marker for those kind of discussions, but I think that statements like that data portability, and maybe I'm paraphrasing here a little bit, but I don't think it's not a lot of paraphrasing, to be honest. The data portability is innovation enhancing by definition almost, and that it will yield better quality of services. I think these statements are quite bold and should be provided with a little bit more evidence in my perspective, and also acknowledge the complexity of the markets that we are dealing with here. I think speaking about those markets, and then I'll stop here, we all know, and I think within CERRE we've been discussing this before, of course, and this will not be the end of the debate today either. Those markets are heterogeneous, they are fast moving, they are dynamic. In my view, there's a lot of innovation in those markets. So when there's a statement that we need more innovation, I'm really curious to find a little bit more evidence about what that kind of innovation would be. We also see new players coming on the markets recently still. I think the most famous one is Zoom, of course, over the crisis, but also TikTok and other messaging services are gaining in popularity given the different specifics or the innovations they built into those kind of services. These, in my view, if you take the competition angle, should be taken into account. I think that those kind of analysis should be fact-based, and theories underlying should be validated with numbers and some evidence at the minimum to make those a little bit harder. I think your conclusions in the end are a little bit more often. So I sense that there's a bit of a, I wouldn't call it a contradiction, but tension between those parts of the report where you are illustrating that. But I see that also as an encouragement for the next report that will come from this. That's it. Thank you, Alexander.
Thank you very much for sharing your experience and also your analysis. And it's true, this is one of the difficulty in those markets, is that first, there is a lot of trade-off to be done in every public intervention, and we mentioned some in the report, and we will mention again in the next report. A lot of trade-off and clearly a lot of dynamism. We had a conversation just last week on that, and you can find this conversation again on the CERRE YouTube channel between Nicolas Petit and Isabel de Silva, and it's true that there is a lot of dynamism in those industry, and I think this is we as policymaker, we need to keep that kind of innovation. Now let's go to our last panelist, who is one of the father in a way of the portability right, and so I don't know if you recognize your child and if you agree with the improvement to your child we propose in the report. Thank you very much, Paul, for being with us. You were very instrumental in the adoption of the GDPR, so you know the topic better than anyone else, I think, at least on the GDPR. And so we are really looking to your remark. Thanks a lot.
Yes, thank you, first of all, for the excellent report. It's very inspiring. And since the adoption of the GDPR, the criticism of this article, I would say, has increased. And my feeling is rightly so. I think there are critics from many directions. In the German Data Ethics Commission report, page 136 onwards, you find a very detailed account of our discussions in the German Data Ethics Commission, where there was a similar shyness of a majority as there was in council at the time of the adoption of this provision. You can see that some of the arguments we've just heard from Facebook representative, and this is classic whenever you try to have portability rules, whether on telephone numbers or on other types of data. The incumbents, of course, they're not totally against it, but they have doubts whether really the innovation effect will come about. And they are asking for evidence-based policymaking. But of course, in a market which is highly dominated, there is no evidence of what's going to happen if you open up competition through regulation. So I think we have to get used in this technology colonialized world in which we are living with fast-moving technologies to a type of innovative lawmaking, which actually is based more on imagination, and I like to call this technological fantasies, rather than the old style evidence-based policymaking, because we will not find evidence for being sure that, for example, a good rule and a much more open rule than we have it now in GDPR on portability will yield the benefits we're looking for. And we are also not fully able to assess the cost of such a rule. But I think in a situation in which we are, where the platforms become ever more dominant, ever more powerful, it is important for regulators to anticipate and to move forward. And we have to move on these things much more faster than in the past. So let me say a few words on the interpretation of this article. First of all, I think the guidance of the European Data Protection Board is as shy as was the lawmaker. And I think in terms of coverage, one could have gone a little bit further. I think the debate, generally speaking, in data protection between provided data, observed data, and derived data is a very important debate. And one thing must be clear. Certainly, GDPR as a whole must apply fully to derived data, because the personal data which is derived from other personal data is new personal data. And if we cannot apply GDPR fully to derived data, we have a problem of effectiveness, because the derived data is actually the predictions of behavior of which Facebook carries out, according to its chief IT and AI engineer, Jan LeCun, 2 billion a day, so around 1,000 per client. This is the key substance of protection of personal data, these conclusions which are drawn about people. And I think it is not impossible to go a little bit further in the scope of the interpretation of the portability rule than the European Data Protection Board has done. That's my first remark. Because one has to look at the purpose of the rule. And the purpose of the rule is to give power to the individual to benefit from competition. So this is not a data protection rule here. We had a long debate at the time in council and also in the parliament about the question, what's the legal basis for the portability rule? And it's not data protection, but because the Court of Justice has always said ancillary rules to a body of law can be passed on the same legal basis. This was also the case, and it was possible also to pass this here, because this is an ancillary rule to the classic data protection rules in GDPR. So that's the first comment. The second comment is, from which angle do those who want to drive data portability forward come, and whose benefit do we want to serve? In one of the previous presentations today, we have heard that consent should not be an obstacle to data portability. Now, that sounds to me like a very industry-driven type of portability, which is argued, because in the data portability rule of the GDPR, it's not only consent, it is the initiative of the individual which drives data portability. So we have to look very closely when we talk about data portability. And there are 4 who can benefit. First, the individual. That is the purpose of the GDPR portability rule. Second, the competitors. I think that is also a purpose of the portability rule in the GDPR. But of course, the theory underlying the provision is the individuals will benefit because if there are competitors who have a chance because they get data through portability, that's good for the individual as a consumer. Third beneficiary can be dominant players. And this was also a big concern in the data ethics group, commission of the German government. If you look into the report, very detailed report, 250 pages, very long debates, very good composition. You know, we had the president of German Industry Association, the president of the Consumer Association, we had the head of the Artificial Intelligence Institute of Germany, and so on. And their concern was indeed that dominant companies would be best placed to use data portability in their favor. So they would be best able to make an attractive offer to the individuals to say, look, you know, here it's very easy to transfer data to us. Just push the button here and we'll do the rest. And so they argued that an enlarged data portability rule could even strengthen dominance. So I think that's something to be kept in mind when one further develops the portability rule. In fact, I think the rule on the discussion on interconnectivity, for example, on social networks and on messengers, is the next step of the portability debate. And it was very interesting. The Data Ethics Commission, the German Data Ethics Commission, in which I participated, we came then to the conclusion that interconnectivity obligations must be asymmetrical in the beginning. So we would oblige, let's say, the big players of social networks or messengers to open up for connection to the newcomers in the field in order to allow for competition, but not the other way around. And I think it is possible to also further develop the portability rule if the legislator wants to, if politics wants to, in an asymmetrical fashion. And I think this is important to think about. And the fourth beneficiary, of course, can be public good purposes. That is also something to think about. There's also a weakness in this data portability rule in the sense that it only applies to individuals and personal data. What about the businesses who want to avail themselves of data portability? A very important subject also for your report. You know, think of all the, for example, comparison websites which compare services, whether hotels, taxis, whatever products. You know, do businesses also have the right, if they change, for example, rating, if they change comparison websites and services, do they actually get the right to carry with them the ranking or rating they had in the other service? And I would say they should have that right, but that needs new legislation. So to conclude, I would like to say that there is a very dirty business going on in terms of exchange of data between companies, which is called mutual data enrichment programs. And I wouldn't want to see GDPR Article 20, which was designed for the power of the individual, to be distorted and to be abused into something which allows companies to do the following. I give you my data about this data subject, and you give me your data about this data subject. and we both benefit, and the data subject is better exploited by both of us. So we have to be very clear that part of the debate about the easy transfer of data is about intentions of the big guys to do mutual data enrichment programs, which will make individuals just even more just the cheap exploitable object, which I think in the planning of many of these data companies, they are anyway already today. And I think so on this, we have to be careful when we are developing further data portability. It must stay a tool of power for the individual, and it should not become something which, on the contrary, quote, consent should not be an obstacle, quote, is used to help powerful companies to have even more power over the individual than they already have under the present regime. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. It's always good to remember what was the purpose of the rule, and you were there when the rule was negotiated, so you know better than anyone. And indeed, it was to protect the individuals. And there is always a risk with a law, this one as every other law, that there are some perfect effects that we should care about. Now, and we may come back on this technical fantasy base. That's, I think, a bit provocative. I suppose you speak in your own name and not the name of the Commission. Because if we have to do the impact assessment on that basis, it may be complicated. But I see what you mean, and I do not necessarily disagree. Now, the thing is that I think we have, and to also to come back to what Johan was saying, and to the critique that Christian was saying at the beginning, I think we have some experience already in some sector where data has been indeed shared and port, and innovation has been created, and the open banking comes to mind. So I think, even if we want to remain the traditional way, let's say the evidence-based, and which I think is important, I think we can find some example in open banking. Now, Jan, I would like to come back to you, and I mean, there has been a lot of questions, so thank you for that. But I think one or two very important questions that have been in Slido and in the debate is around the standardization and API and what should be done, and in particular, do you think the Commission should go further in terms of imposing or stimulating a standardization of API, and if yes, and that's another question, but which is linked to that, should it be sectoral or horizontal? And this is a question we have in particular in reaction to the Lucy presentation. I mean, of course, Lucy, your presentation was sectoral because you are a sectoral regulator, but then the question is, should we go further? So maybe, Jan, if you can start on this issue of standardization, and maybe Pierre, if you want to complement, you are welcome as well.
Yes, thank you very much for all these responses. Probably we won't have time to go through all of them, but I very much agree with a lot that has been said. Not everything, but a lot that has been said. Now, in terms of the standardization, yes, I mean, what we lay out in the report, on the one hand, is that what we have in mind is, of course, a new piece of legislation here that enables continuous data portability. And specifically tailored, as I said, the report is specifically tailored in the context of personal data in the digital economy, where this data usually is available already. So we don't have, such with these just legacy systems, as it's been in the case, for example, in open banking or in banking generally, and also in some of the network industries. So generally here in the digital economy already have databases which are have a very high performance rating, and there's also internal APIs a lot of times in place already that we could utilize for this. However, there must also be some sort of proportionality principle here, that you're not, because this is also one of the things that has been said in context of the GDPR, that the larger you are as a company, the easier it is to comply with the regulations, and it's a hindrance for small startups. So there must be some kind of proportionality principle here, that such continuous data portability is not becoming an overly burden. We also think that in terms of the question whether it should be sectoral or not, I mean, we're already looking at, if you will, the digital sector in this report, which of course is not a sector in the context of telco or energy that we like to think about traditionally. But nevertheless, if you think about some of the things that are happening in the data transfer project or in the project Solid already, people are there thinking very much in so-called verticals. So they think of data in being of different types. So you might have communication data, for example, you might have picture data on the other hand, and then the total set of data to be transferred is sort of a conglomerate of these different verticals. And for each of these different verticals, you can define certain standards in which they can be in place. So of course, this will be an effort, and this is an ongoing effort also in computer science, and Pierre maybe can say a little bit more about that. So this is nothing that we can resolve once and for all in this report. So there will be some continuous effort necessary, but we believe that it can be done and it can be overcome, and we're already making this progress in some of these projects already. Yeah. So maybe I would allow Pierre to say a little bit more on this technical aspect.
Maybe if I may just, Pierre, to add one thing. So there is this issue of standardization, because we have heard three words here. We are technical word: standardization, interoperability, and interconnection in an asymmetric way. So how do you see? Do you think we should go the three? Do you think we should go for only some of them? How do you see that technically?
There are lots of questions here. So on standardization, I think so a full standardization of how data portability should be implemented by different actors, different platforms, is extremely ambitious. I'm not sure it's really realistic to specify completely how the data portability should work, but a limited amount of standardization is quite easy to achieve. So, for instance, we envision that the current APIs that platforms are providing to develop applications on top of the data that they are already providing could be a basis for continuous data portability. And these APIs almost all work in the same way. They are RESTful APIs, they are producing JSON outputs, they are using OAuth for access delegation. So they are technically very similar. And so it wouldn't be much of an issue to require using these same kind of technologies, because this is a natural choice and this is very widely used. Now, this would not suffice for complete standardization and indeed for interoperability, because, for instance, the data format of the output of any such API or any such data portability functionality would be different. In some areas, it might be feasible to require a top-down standardization on how data should be provided. So for some application domains, for some kinds of personal data, this might make sense because it's very well defined. For personal data at large, it doesn't necessarily make sense because it's hard to predict what kind of data would be held and would be exported by different platforms. In these cases, it might make more sense for the industry to sit together and to discuss some form of standard way of representing data, which they have done, for instance, in the schema.org initiative for web data. On data portability, interoperability, interconnection, I mean, if you have a very, very deep interoperability of data, obviously you can develop more things, you can do more things. But I would argue that it would be very good already to have some form of continuous data portability, because without that, you cannot do you cannot do any innovative application on top of the data, because you don't have access to the data that are held by platforms in an easy programmable way. If you have that, then you can develop a number of ad hoc manners to convert data provided from one platform to the data expected by another platform, etc. So it's already a very good starting point.
Okay, thank you very much. We are about to close, unfortunately. So I just want to give maybe the last word to Jan. If you had one advice to give to the Commission, as we know, the Commission is thinking a lot about its data strategy. And so if you have one advice to say to the Commission and to Thierry Breton, who, as we know, is very keen of having a good data economy, and rightly so, in Europe, what would you tell him?
Yes. So we really believe that this right to continuous data portability is very important. So GDPR has been a first step, but as a horizontal regulation, we also see that it's not very widely adopted as of now, and consumers also don't widely adopt it. So we also, I mean, a part of imposing this right to continuous data portability with a proportionality measure in place, we also think that consumers should be educated more on their right to port data from one service to another. And so that they will actually demand this more and create sort of force from the bottom to do this. So this was one insight we've seen from our investigations, that although you're obliged to export data as a company, many companies don't import the data. So they don't provide import adapters. So this renders the current right to data portability a little bit mute. And we believe that with standardized interfaces in place and sort of this right of consumers to port their data like this, accompanied with an information campaign, this will actually become a tool that is more widely used. And then these positive side effects that we have in mind, I very much agree with the context of that there's a lack of empiricism on it, because there's also a lack of data that you could do this empiricism on, but that we should use this foresight type of regulation here to improve innovation and potentially also competition in the digital economy.
Thank you very much, Jan. Thank you to all the speakers. It was very interesting to listen to your different point of view. And this is what also we like at CERRE, to have the different view and point of view. I would like also to thank you, the CERRE team, for having organized that. The report, as I said, is available on the CERRE website, and you have the address on my back. And as we have already said, there will be another report, even a longer report, that we will present on the 9th of September on more the contestability economic aspect of data. So stay tuned. Thank you very much, and good afternoon to all.